Welcome, folks, to Ask Strong Towns Anything. Today, our special guest is Chuck Marone, and I'm excited to welcome Chuck as the person that many people have questions for. And the first question from Raleigh in Austin is, what is the next book? And can you tell us a little bit about it, and what should we be looking forward to?
Thank you. Is a good question. I told the publisher that I was not going to sign a contract until August for the next book, but we tentatively have a date when it's due of next March. So like 11 months from now. And that book will be on economic development. Um, I'm starting with the idea. Okay, I'll give you this like thought experiment, and this is what I walk the publisher through as well. We're all Many of us are familiar with the idea of Black Wall Street in Tulsa. Black Wall Street, the story that we're often given is it was this very successful place in Tulsa, and white people got upset and they went in, and there was I don't even know how you would describe it. People got lynched, things got burned down, horrible riots. It was just a really like bad thing. And then that story is like, that's the story. And obviously, I think there's lessons to learn in that story. I think there's a lot of things in that story. But to me, what's always fascinated me, or what I initially like, okay, hang on a sec. You're starting the story at the end. I want to start the story at the beginning. How did Black Wall Street become so successful? What made it Black Wall Street? Because if you just step back, thank you. I was looking for the word massacre. If you step back and look at this, the people who made Black Wall Street successful had none of the things that we kind of deem as prerequisites for success. These were largely former slaves or direct descendants from slaves. They did not start with a lot of capital. They did not start with education, access to markets. You go through all the things. I mean, they certainly weren't getting public support and subsidies. You go through all of the things that we have kind of deemed are part of a successful economic development strategy. They had none of them, yet they built something that was really very successful and very robust. How do they do that? And when you dig into that story just a little bit, the answer that hits you across the face is they built it incrementally from the bottom up with a deep emphasis on community. Money that would come in to the community would get passed around many, many, many times before it exited. There was kind of the old-fashioned Jane Jacobs import replacement strategy on steroids. And this was done largely out of necessity, but it also was done intentionally as part of a strategy to build wealth and success in a place. I pair this with the story that Sam Quinones told me. I had him on the podcast a while ago to talk about Hazard, Kentucky, a city of, I mean, really, this is not a disparaging thing, but I'm going to say it the way that he said it. A city of opioid addicts, where a really high disproportionate number of people have opioid addiction recovery as part of their life story. And they've come together in a city that was otherwise kind of dying and run down and overlooked, and made that their home, and have grown a place that has been, I'm not going to say it's the most successful city ever, but are growing a place that is increasingly successful. And when you dig into that story, what you see is that they took large buildings and made them small. They took big spaces that people couldn't afford and made them small places that they could. And they helped people get started and then expanded that over time. And it's very much this like incremental story of success. I feel like there are lessons for us to learn in these two stories. One, from 100 years ago, one from modern day, about how we actually build wealth in a place. That's the next book. And I've got a lot of research yet to do. I feel like this summer is going to be a lot of that. I've been doing a little bit of it, but I'm going to kick in a lot more now that Easter's passed and summer's here, or will be here shortly. I said I want to start till August because my youngest daughter exits the house in August, and I figured that would be the best time to start digging in again. So that's the plan.
Yeah, some people cope by golfing, other people go and write a book, and but I think that will be yeah, certainly needed and just a fantastic item. And I think it relates to our next question, which is what can I do to affect change when my city is filed for bankruptcy? This is in Chester, Pennsylvania, and I want to pull up something that you wrote about in terms of strong Chester. You said, speaking of cities that have been destroyed by transportation projects, few have embarrassed me to be an engineer more than Chester, a great city that we've destroyed and continue to abuse with our improvements, and sharing just one of the historic photos and saying, like, this is what it used to be, and now the place is suffering. And obviously, there's a lot there. The city is currently still in bankruptcy. They've just had to replace their receiver. And even one of the strategies was to sell off $400 million of their water authority in order to recoup about a $400 million pension deficit that they were running up against. In that sort of a context, with Tyler's question here, what can I as an individual do to affect change when my city is in such a state?
I'm so sad and depressed when it comes to Chester. I really am. Um, Chester was one of those early strong towns case studies that really, when I first got the opportunity to travel outside of the Midwest and talk strong towns, affected me deeply. In 2013, I wrote in, I think it was 2012 or 2013, about this interchange project in Chester that, was designed to get the soccer stadium and a casino. And the thing that offended me, I mean, there were a bunch of things that were offensive about it, but the one that kind of was the spark, the catalyst of offense was the state engineering society, contractor society giving an award to the state DOT for this great project in Chester. And then the state DOT publishing press releases and going on like this, happy tour of, aren't we great? We're getting these awards, when what they were getting was an award from the organization that represents the contractors that they awarded the money to build this thing that nobody needed, that really didn't address the problems that were happening in Chester. I went in 2013. I did a tour of Pennsylvania. That was one of the earliest Strong Towns tours that we ever did, and I went to Chester just to see it and to try to understand. And I think, disparity between the way people lived in Chester and the way the stuff was not loved and not taken care of, not by the people there, but by society at large, and how much energy had been expended building this interchange, ostensibly to help them, but really to exploit their poverty in order to get money to prop up a stadium and a casino, which did not benefit them. I mean, I think that's obvious. It was obvious then, and I think it's even more obvious now in hindsight. That article and that video and that series of conversations about Chester actually was part of what got me invited to the White House in like 2014, 2015, somewhere in that range, because they were also deeply concerned about Chester. And as I sat in the executive office building and chatted with people, the thing that it was one of the topics that came up, but when we talked about Chester, the statement of exploitation was one that was uttered like multiple times. Like, this is a city that the system has exploited. And what it is like, you have poverty, minority population in a state that is kind of used to doing big boondoggle infrastructure projects. And so are we starting with people's needs, or are we starting with the project we want to do? And over and over and over again, we started with the project we wanted to do and imposed it on people. if the question is like, I live here, what do I do now? I don't feel like the immediate answer in Chester will either come from City Hall or will come from any like publicly organized group, organization that's going to impact this. I really do feel, and I think this is brutally unfair, and I'm not happy. I'm not happy about this, but I feel like the places that a revolution in Chester would start would be in church, in a synagogue, in a mosque, in a civic organization, in a quasi Rotary Club, in a neighborhood group. I think it will happen outside of government. And I think that it will, to me, the only thing that I see helping right now is to build those kind of civic institutions that can ultimately affect and direct the dysfunction that, and I hate to say these words because I'm not looking with criticism at Chester the way I would, a second ring, third ring suburb of Dallas, that's got all the money pouring in and all that. But I do think there's a deep dysfunction in the city hall in Chester because of the feedback loop with the state and the federal government and that exploitation train. That feedback loop, I think it's really not a healthy place. And so to me, I would love to find a way for us at Strong Towns to support the civic organizations in Chester. And to me, those are the ones that are deserving of your time and energy. And I feel like by fixing as many of those as we can, or making as many of those as we can important and viable and urgent and responsive to the people that are there, we have the best chance of affecting the local government and what they do. That would be my answer. And I feel like it's an incomplete answer, but that's how I would approach it. Norm, I don't know. Is that?
I know that that's always the challenge. I did a quick look up to see if is yet a local conversation group in the community. That is certainly part of it, is trying to shift that conversation around what can we do, especially when our local conversation groups become part of a group that says, hey, what is the next smallest thing that we can do with limited amounts of money and being able to rebuild that prosperity that is needed. But yeah, it sort of looms large because there just is such a desperate need. And then sometimes the short term efforts to, hey, what if we just sell off, key assets that we're going to rely on and to be beholden to for many, many years. And maybe actually, do you want to touch on that? Like the idea that I think in one of the pieces you said, hey, sometimes the benefit of a private water utility is that they're willing to raise rates when public water utilities are unwilling to do so because of political calculations. You want to maybe share a little bit more on that? Like maybe I know that that's an oversimplification.
No, it is. But when you look at a city like Chester, you know, Chester has been gutted, and like the good parts sold off and the bad parts ignored.
Yeah.
It really has been okay. You have a waterfront. You know, I look at the waterfront and like, could this be a benefit to the city of Chester? You've got a whole like salvage yard up the river from where the casino and the soccer stadium are. Could these be, in a sense, legacy value? Could this land be a legacy value for the city? Well, the people who are in a position to do that or who are looking to do that are outside of the city. And they're looking at it saying, how do we, in a sense, either replace the city of Chester with, better people or people who can afford this? Or how do we exploit this resource, in a sense, for the gain of others? Yeah. I look at it as like a shiny object. Mm-hmm. And to me, when you look at the city of Chester, where do people work? How do they get across the street safely? how do they have safety in their homes? How do they take care of their homes? I mean, there's so many like base things,
Yeah.
and private water system or this interface between like the official forms of government to me presuppose a functioning system and a functioning relationship that I don't think exists there. And so I don't, there's a lot there's a lot that rhymes with the Flint, Michigan stuff, which, when I've written about the Flint, Michigan stuff, it's probably the things that I've been the most criticized for publicly by certain segments of society. Because I said, going to Flint and just replacing their water system with a brand new, like the same thing, just better, is going to be good for engineers and good for contractors and good for grant programs and all that. But it really isn't designed to have Flint get from here to here. It's designed to just keep them here long term with lots of debt and lots of overhang and we actually need to start where people are and help them build up. And I don't feel like for Chester, that is going to come through any of the kind of post-war programs we have that tie infrastructure to prosperity. They just the things on the ground do not have that relationship. So,
And then you mentioned the salvage yards and other
yeah.
sort of spaces that are either under control of a single property owner, or actually in the case of many instances, you'll see lots that are held by the city because they've been turned over to the city. And I remember you did a walk through Kamloops, British Columbia with some of their city staff, and they were looking at a large city-owned parking lot that was not being well used. And they said, hey, like, we're struggling to find a single buyer because we want that buyer to put up housing. We want that buyer to, sort of fulfill our laundry list. And you had a very different approach where you said, partition it or sort of like replat it and sell it off lot by lot. I feel like that does touch on the ability that a place like Chester has to sort of balloon the amount of value that's coming in terms of the municipal property taxes that come from each parcel of land that they have. What does that look like in a place like that where you create small scale opportunities instead of looking for the big out of state buyer to come in?
So I feel like so let me give the difference between Kamloops. So Edward, who's on this call, has been doing these great videos that have really blown up on all of our video platforms, where he shows a block and like the 2 or 3 houses on the block, and then how you would, planners would call it infill, but infill is like taking the dumb code we have now and trying to repeat it. What Edward is showing is how we would actually make the next version of a city, the next maturing of a neighborhood in that place. Yeah. And so you go from 3 houses to 14 houses, and they're all kind of self-reinforcing in a way, like each one builds on the next, and you get a really good block out of it. I think Chester could do that for the next 20 years and be in like a much better place than they are now, without ever touching the salvage yards or the soccer stadium or any of the stupid stuff that's kind of being imposed on them. Yeah. Like I think that they could do that level of stuff. They could do that themselves. They could do it with kind of more localized capital, and the wealth would accrue to the people who are there in a way that is like deeply meaningful and kind of reflective of the Black Wall Street conversation that we had, earlier. If we look at the salvage yards, I think there's this idea that, well, what we need to do is get one big developer to come in, buy up the whole thing, and then redevelop it. And then we'll get condo units along the river, and that will create tax base. And oh, yay, that will, help the people of Chester, because now they can have more money to fix their sidewalks. As a development strategy, it is a high risk with, demonstrably low rewards when we look at other places that have done this. I also question whether this would actually have that payoff, or it would just become the wealthy enclave of Chester next to the poor enclave of Chester, divided by a Strode, which is kind of how it would be. But if you were actually serious about it, If this was actually like the undertaking that what you were going to do, you would not get one developer in to do the whole thing. One developer is going to ask for tax subsidies and handouts and like all this stuff. What you would do is you would have the city, again, higher level sophistication than they have today, but you would get a competent city in who would be, in a sense, the master developer, would lay it all out, and then would sell small pieces. So you could get that first iteration and have it cycle up and cycle up and cycle up. If you did that, you would have lots of owners, lots of, in a sense, diversity of building types and ownership ways and price points. And you would have something that would be not only financially like more productive and higher yielding for the city, but more organic, that would actually have a resilience and a capacity to adapt over time that is needed in all cities, but especially in a place like Chester.
And spreading out the risk of failure to many more sources rather than it all being all in. I mean, they already have the casino, and that sort of
Yeah.
prioritizes where the big bets lie. Raleigh's
So
asked,
here's
yeah,
I saw this thing from Raleigh, and here's the interesting thing. I think that the idea of being scalable or replicable
mm,
is an interesting distinction, because if you look at like soccer stadiums, a soccer stadium is replicable. Like we can go build a soccer stadium in Chester and we can build one, you know, maybe each state can get 4 or 5 soccer stadiums and we can do that like over and over again. So there's a couple hundred of these that can be done across the US. You can say, well, that's replicable and scalable. Like, we can drop this thing in, or, you look at like a McDonald's, like here's the standard McDonald's, we'll just build it over and over and over. And that's replicable. I hesitate for us to look at that as replicable and then say, like the stuff that Edward drew out is not replicable and scalable. If the idea is to get, I mean, I've said this in my town, we're building the new 5/1 up the street and we're getting 86 units. And I'm like, if we went and just, put a house in between every house where there's extra space, we could get 160 units, not 86. I mean, we get double that just in these few blocks here because there's so much space. That is both replicable over and over and over and highly scalable in a way that doing like one project here and one project here is not. The only thing that is scalable about the one big project is the financing. The centralized financing does kind of favor that and make that like an easier thing to do. I think I wrote this in the book, but I've said this a number of times. It's easier for the right people. It's easier to borrow 50 million than it is to borrow 500,000. The people who can borrow 50 million, it's easy to borrow 50 million. And of the people who could borrow 500,000, it's really, really hard to do. And so what we've done is we've made it easy to do the big project. Like the bar of entry's lower for the people in position to do that. But it's hard for like a normal, like you or me, Norm, to go out and borrow $500,000 to do a neighborhood scale project. It's much, much harder.
yeah.
That should be flipped around in some way.
One, isn't that the story of each Wall Street, is that it's actually an agglomeration of so many small and discrete actors, all having a role to play, all being able to participate at the scale that works for them.
Yeah.
I'm mindful of Raleigh's question, which is, can we please have one that talks about good success stories? But I think that there's an interesting question about the challenge of, hey, if the high cost of the suburban experiment can be chalked up to the American tendency to overpay for public investment, is that sort of a distortion that creates the situation that we find ourselves in, thinking especially of Connor Doherty's article in the New York Times on why sprawl might be the answer. Do you want to respond to the idea that, there is a better way to build suburbia at lower cost, and that the idea of doing so would then yield sort of a more, utopian future where the suburbs actually weren't as much of a financial net drain?
I've been in meetings all morning, so I'm coming in hot to this conversation. I know you sent me at some point. Here's some questions that we're going to ask. I haven't seen any of these. This is an interesting question but I think it oversimplifies what's going on. So let me, without getting too like abstract in economics, why do we overpay for infrastructure? And I think, you can look at it and simply say, well, there's corruption and we have unions and that. Yeah, but tell me France doesn't have that. Like France has all that, like, and then some. What a lot of this can be chalked up to is just the inflationary effect of throwing a lot of money at something. If you have like X number of asphalt contractors and then you double the amount of money, double the amount of roads you're building in a year, I mean, I've been in this industry for a long time. What you see is that at some point, the asphalt contractors like, we're so damn busy, we can't do this. And so I'm just going to bid like an insane number. And then they're like, haha, I got the project. Now I got to figure out how to do it at triple the cost. That happens all the time. All the time. And I've been on so many projects. I mean, in my younger days as an engineer, when I was doing like site inspection and stuff, and you'd be talking to the contractor and they're like, yeah, we didn't plan on doing this. We put in like an insane bid because we were already like have everybody booked. And we knew that if we were going to do this extra project, it was going to have to be at some like crazy price where we could hire more people and buy more plant and equipment and bring more people in. And so we bid this crazy price and we got this job. This is all like a byproduct of the way we have chosen to develop. I think that if we actually, build in a different way, the price would be a lot less. But let me tie this in, and I feel like this is the feedback loops that's missing in this question. Part of the value of your house is overinflated, likewise, because of this craziness. So it costs X amount to, if we're going to solve the housing crisis by building a lot more infrastructure, a lot more roads, a lot more houses, they're all single family houses. They all have big yards. They all have like 2,800, 3,200 square feet. They all have granite countertops. Yeah, bam, bam, bam. Like that's what we're going to do. The price of all that is going to be really, really high. I don't think there's like, okay, we'll lower the infrastructure cost by being more like France and whatever that means, and we'll lower the infrastructure costs, and then that will make homes cheaper. It won't. The homes are a function of, in a sense, the money sloshing through the system. The only way that you affect one without affecting the other is to actually like turn them both off. There's a feedback loop between the overpaying for the infrastructure and the overpaying for the home, where if you could solve the one, the other one would, in a sense, correct. In other words, you could either live in a world where everything costs X overinflated, or you can live in a world where everything costs Y not overinflated, but the proportion, the ratio is going to be the same. The city's going to collect this much from this side and this much from this side, and here's how much they're going to pay. And whether that is all overinflated or that's all here, it's all going to be relative. I feel like this is missing like a bunch of feedback loops. I probably didn't explain that real well, but am I close, Norm?
Yep. No, I think that's helpful. And it certainly touches on, the reality that when people ask, like, how much does it cost to pave, a street? We'll say, it depends, but also there are a lot of things that we can do to juice the input price and then cause, the consequence of having to maintain it or repair it to continue to increase in over time as well.
Let me say it this way. If you pay less, if we could somehow make it so like we pay less per mile per street, that means your house is going to cost less. That does not mean you're going to be richer. That's going to mean, you will proportionally make less money. These things are all like related to each other in like a macroeconomic way. There's a lot of money sloshing around the American system, and it inflates everything in a sense.
Yeah. Yeah. Let's
everything that we choose to like pour money at, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Speaking of pouring money into things, what will happen when the housing market, this is from Peter, he says, what happens when the housing market turns from a seller's market into a buyer's market, as birth rates indicate that that's going to happen?
This is a fascinating question. I wrote in the book in the housing trap, and I said this in a video, and it's funny because the feedback that I've gotten, YouTube is such a weird place because you can post stuff and then all these, people will listen for 10 seconds. And then like, I know the one comment is like, this guy is an idiot, meaning me, idiot, idiot, idiot. I did a video and the team here titled it, Why Housing Prices Can't Go Down. The feedback loop that we have is that if the market turns from a seller's market into a buyer's market, that can persist for a little bit of time. But if it persists for a longer period of time, what has to happen, and I think this is the underlying tension of both our financial system and of the housing market, what has to happen is there has to be some kind of intervention to prop up prices. There are kind of localized places where prices can go down and stay down for a while. But nationally, just broadly speaking, we will not be able to experience that and have our financial system function. So whether that will be, more incentives to buy homes, whether it will be lower interest rates to get people to buy homes, whether it will be down payment assistance, the idea of people owning multiple homes, owning Airbnbs that they rent out, we will do what needs to be done to, in a sense, prop up current prices. I think that's the inevitable outcome. So if it becomes a buyer's market, I don't think that could persist for a while in localized markets, but I don't think nationally it can persist that long. I think it will have to be, there will have to be some intervention or correction to turn it back into a seller's market, because so much of our economy depends on that happening. So
yeah.
Does that make sense?
It does. And I think the fingerprints of sort of the macro level policy sort of interference in the housing market is pretty plain when 75% of the Canadian deficit last year was actually propping up the mortgage industry and making sure that CMHC bonds Canada Mortgage and Housing Corporation bonds that were not selling on the open market were being purchased by the federal government in order to prop up prices. All the while rolling out the first-time home buyers credit and, the Canadian Housing Accelerator in paltry amounts compared to the amount of money that we were spending to backstop the high prices. So we were trying to figure out ways to add more housing supply and backstop high prices. And it's
the housing trap.
A pitchfork in my hand.
If you go back to, the Great Depression, the economic lessons coming out of the Great Depression, and this is really, John Maynard Keynes, was sometimes the economy will start to decline. It'll go into recession, it will go into depression. And the role of government is to step in and to counteract that, to, in a sense, make up for, and this is the paradox of thrift, when things start to go bad, people pull back because I'm worried about the future. So I don't go out and spend, I save my money. And what happens is the economy starts to slow down then, and the slowdown reinforces the slowdown. Government can step in and spend and counteract that and give people the confidence to go out and spend. That makes, let's give Keynes his due. That makes sense in an economy where population is growing, things are expanding, and you just have economic cycles. But what if your downturn is because your population is declining by 20%? What if your downturn is because you overbuilt and overspent and it's actually a correction, not a downturn? What if we're in the hotel industry and we just built 50% more hotel rooms than we need? If the government's stepping in and propping up the hotel price, is that really helping anything, or is that, creating a negative, a negative feedback loop where now we overbuild hotels by 50%, we'll prop up the price, and now we're going to get an overbuild by 60% or 80%. I think this is a conundrum that we have, is that we built an economy and a housing sector specifically based on growing demand, increasing demand, tied them to these financial instruments that also have to grow. And the natural, course and progression of things is that we need smaller homes, we need more affordably priced homes, we need them in many different neighborhoods. And that means there should, in a natural sense, be a big housing correction, but that correction can't happen.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
That we can't allow it to happen, and the underlying way we react to downturns is to flood the market with money so that it actually can't. And that's where there's a tension there that has to work itself out.
Within that tension, I think we've been putting a lot of emphasis on the idea that we need to re-normalize starter homes, smaller form factors, allowing those types of things to emerge within neighborhoods, in a sense, as not financial products, as just shelter. How does that tension resolve if there's sort of a general market and we're trying to smuggle in a type of housing stock that will have some impact on that broader housing market, but actually just serves a primary need of providing shelter in response to local need? How does that factor in?
I I don't think it can when you have a large interconnected market, right? So what should happen in a functioning market is that San Francisco should be expensive and Brainerd should be cheap because there's abundant there's abundant opportunities in Brainerd and there's limited in San Francisco. And then people should move and change location, or San Francisco should reform because their housing prices and their economy, their salaries and wages are out of whack. What happens instead is that everything is kind of put into one. Think of it as one security. We take houses from San Francisco and we mix them with houses from Texas and Florida and Minnesota, and we put them into one security. And that security is only as strong as like its weakest 3% of members. And so everyone has to, in a sense, have the same feedback loop, the same trajectory, the same like up and down market. I think that this will not work itself out until this will not work itself out in a big picture way until the finance of housing becomes at least more statewide and hopefully more like regionally sensitive as opposed to, nationally sensitive.
That leads to a question that Aaron has posted here on behalf of Kyle, who's a member of the local conversation in Fayetteville, Arkansas. And he said, the way that you've talked, Chuck, about tax increment financing actually having a useful role to play when it comes to allowing for sort of funding small scale development of existing homes being converted or new homes being added to our communities, that there can be something really useful there. But he said the challenge is, what does it take for a city to make tax increment financing function the way that we're promoting that? In places where perhaps the state doesn't allow it. He said, can we make it work in our city, or do we need to start the hopeless process of lobbying our state legislature to change the rules? And I think we've got this quite a bit where people say, yeah, that works in your community, or that might work in Michigan, but we have rules that prevent this. Any insights on that? And where are some of the places where that like it's a no-go? And are there any spaces that you think people can work within that sort of gap that exists?
That's an interesting question. I don't know how tax increment financing works in Arkansas. So I've got a page here about tax increment financing in Arkansas, and I could look at that and give you some advice. I don't really know how it works. Amendment 78, redevelopment, yeah. Every state has different like nuanced rules about this, right? Like each state is sensitive to different things and looks at this in different ways. If the question is like what you're saying for tax increment housing, like the Muskegon example of how they're using TIF for starter homes, that won't work in Arkansas. I don't know enough to say whether that's true or not. If you're telling me that's true, I believe you. If the question is like, should we reform the state to allow that? Or should we like look for other things? I'm like, let's look for other things. I mean, sure, go like reform the state. Like I'm not against that. But TIF net is a negative in most places. I mean, there are very few uses of tax increment financing that I've seen that are very helpful at all. Um, yeah, I would look at other ways to do it. I will say we've gotten so much demand for answers to these kind of like questions, like what are different tools in the toolbox.
Mhm.
We put out the first housing toolkit in January, February. It
Yeah.
was earlier this year.
Mhm.
The second housing toolkit is scheduled to come out in the fall, and that's going to be on incremental developers and how we support them and how we grow a community of them. And then the third toolkit is going to be all about finance, localized housing finance. And I feel like in the book we tried to outline some ideas and point to some examples. And I've been doing that on a book tour too. And what I get is a lot of this kind of question is, okay, these are great, like in the big picture, but like actually break it down and walk us through how we would do this here. And I think we feel like we have to try to solve that problem for people. Um, and so I don't have the direct answer on this one.
Yeah.
Um,
Well, I'm going to bring Erica onto the stage. Erica, you asked about the book Abundance by Ezra Klein and Derek Thompson. Sorry. Do you want to share just what connected it with Strong Towns? Oh, there you go. And yeah, go ahead. And then Chuck, why don't you respond?
Yeah, I was just asking for Chuck's feedback because I took particular umbrage with some of the points that they at least top line make in their book tour interviews. So I wonder if you could just respond to their mapping of wealthy communities or democratic states or cities and the problem with NIMBYism
I have
or
not
other
read
things
Hmm.
or other things
I have
that
not read
you
the book yet. So I can't I have seen a couple interviews, but I have not read the book. Their publisher sent it to me. So this is like a letter from their publisher. And I generally they send these to you when they are willing to go on your podcast. So I have plans. We've been working on other things, but like I said, once we get through some of the writing I've got to do, I have plans to circle back and have them on the show and talk to them. I feel like in the interviews that I've seen, it feels like the tension is kind of the age old tension of, what I'm going to say top down versus bottom up systems. Um, the sense that I get is that they are looking at the situation as kind of if we just get the best and the brightest in the room, create the right top down systems, we can inculcate like better run cities and better change and better housing policies. And what we need is like a New Deal kind of, revolution for the next generation of progressive top-down politics. That might be a good political message, and that might work in some contexts. I would challenge a lot of the assumptions behind that because I feel like, I said this in Strong Towns. I feel like we live in the progressive project of the 1930s and 40s. We're living in the wake of that. The things we're struggling to overcome are the things that the best and brightest of my grandparents' generation came up with and said, here's how we'll structure this world. So I don't know. I'm going to read the book, and I think you can expect that at some point here this summer that we'll have a robust conversation on it and maybe even have them on the podcast. It seems like they're willing to do that, so that would be really cool.
In the book, they talk about a I'll probably mispronounce this, a vetocracy, or where the people with the veto are the ones that end up ruling. Um, can you reflect on that in the context of really advocating, as Strong Towns does, for many more things to be by right and a lot less of the discretionary approvals process, the bow and genuflect before the planning board or before the planning, like there's a lot of the horse trading that we see in order for one project to emerge, or even like housing development that should just like be rubber stamped and yet has to go through this whole rigmarole when it's the next increment of development. And it does feel like we grapple with this idea that there are core individuals or core needs that have to have an unaltered veto, and then everybody else has to sort of fall in line. And we've actually said in contrast, like many times there should be very little public discussion about projects that are coming forward if they fit within the general realm of what we want to see happen in our community.
I feel like the underlying model that is the problem here is that somehow, the system needs to become more or less democratic in certain ways. I feel like there's this really great video that I shared years ago, and we've looked at it internally here too. Let me see if I can find it real quick. It's on subsidiarity. The idea of subsidiarity, and really the thing about this video that I thought was powerful, is it breaks it down not into what is the decision, but who makes the decision and at what level are decisions made.
I put that in the chat.
Oh, you put it. Okay, awesome. Yeah. The idea of having, should we have more housing? That's not a neighborhood level decision. I mean, that is like a macro, that is a citywide, or, in some cases, like a statewide decision, like you will have more housing, or we will build more housing, or we're going to have more housing. The neighborhood decision becomes like, what should this housing look like in my neighborhood? And what we do is we kind of conflate those decisions and then empower people to, make or veto like the decision that is not really theirs to make. Andres Duany explained this like 20 years ago to me in a way that I thought was really good. He called it the chicken problem. And I wrote about this in Strong Nouns, a verse book. Is like, who should decide where the light rail line goes? That's not a neighborhood decision. Like, that's not a decision for people living on a block. Like, you don't get to veto the entire rail line because, of some like local, neighborhood level concern you have. Like, this is a regional thing. But who should decide if your neighborhood should get backyard chickens or not? That is a hyper local decision that you and your neighbors should figure out. That sounds a lot like chaos and anarchy. And I think when it's explained in that way, it sounds like, oh my gosh, like we'll have no rules on chickens and you guys just figure it out. But it actually changes what the role of government is. The role of government is to make the decision where you are the competent level of decision maker. Where should the regional rail line go is a regional conversation. That's a regional board should make that decision. Whether you should have backyard chickens or not is a neighborhood decision. But the idea of subsidiarity is that the higher levels of government, their role is to actually support you in making that decision. Okay, your neighborhood's going to have 30 more housing units. We're not here going to decide it should be this housing unit or that housing unit or like this. What we're here to do at the city level is to work with the neighborhood to figure out where those 30 are going to go. It's not a decision of whether you're going to have 30 or not. You're going to have 30. We're just going to have a conversation here in this neighborhood about what that's going to look like and where those are going to go. It changes the dynamics of the conversation. So it's not like a veto. It is a dialogue. And it's a dialogue that empowers people to, in a sense, own the decision. I feel like this is a big part of the dysfunction. And when we think about like all the conversation coming out of the abundance thing, to me, it is like it is trying to make our system democratic in a different way. So like we tried this version of democratic and now we don't like it. So we're going to take away those powers and add powers over here and make it a little more democratic in favor of these people. And what I would like is to have a system that really leaned into subsidiarity, which is kind of bottom up democratic, where you have not only the ability to veto, but you have the responsibility to like make something work. Because, I mean, this is the problem with NIMBYs. The idea of being able to veto without having to like actually roll up your sleeves and figure out how to make something work is just a really destructive social construct. Communities and societies are, reciprocal relationships. And when we ask people, when we just give people the right to show up and bitch and moan, but no actual authority or responsibility to own decisions and make them work, I think we create the worst kind of citizen. When we actually say to citizens like, hey, the city will not solve the problem of backyard chickens for you. You have to solve this yourself. We will sit down with, I mean, we're going to send out like a social worker or a conflict resolution person who's going to sit down and work with you on figuring this out. But like, you got 2 months, you're going to figure this out. Like, let's sit down and do it. To me, that's the way you really empower people.
And I think it speaks to maybe the shift that occurs in places like Oswego with the Renaissance Association, where they've just said, hey, we're actually going to pivot to what are the things that we can do together, where they assign a grant to a whole block, but you have to have 60% of the homes actively participating in that. And that unleashes a lot of the opportunities that people are looking for. And I think in particular around like regulating nuisances, oftentimes those nuisances are very, very local and ought to be experienced or sort of dealt with at the most local levels. And I just think that that's something that we can connect with. And part of the process too, as I think about it, is that when we just assign people a role as a taxpayer in a city, it's a very basic equation of like, I put X amount of money into the system and what do I get out of it? Yeah, there's a park I can go to, but I don't like it because, they don't have the things that my kids like. And, the pool is not totally the right temperature. So I don't think I'm getting a fair deal. How do we pivot people from really seeing that role as like a taxpayer in a system, getting something out in exchange for what they put in versus like the citizen or the resident that really has a deeper role?
Well, I feel like there's a transition here, right? And let me say this in a coarse way, and don't be offended by this because I don't mean this in a disrespectful way. But there's a dummy system now that we operate in, and we would like to replace it with a more bottom-up subsidiarity nuance system. And I think there's a way for neighborhoods. I mean, I interviewed some people from the UK a couple years ago who had a model of like if neighborhoods could opt into this other option, and that would give them more neighborhood control, but more flexibility. So it was like, we're going to opt into building more housing. And when we do that, we will create our own neighborhood plan and then, basically build by that plan. But in order to opt in, you had to buy into the idea that, hey, here's our number of units. Here's our, you had to buy into a target of incremental growth. I feel like we could do that on a broad scale in a city sense, which is, all right, here's road maintenance. We have this many roads and we have this much money. For neighborhoods that want to opt in to, in a sense, taking care of things on their own or having a more influence on their own, instead of getting your small share of this like dwindling pie, we will give you a little bit more or we'll help you out, but you're going to take like ownership, like you're gonna have narrower streets. We're not gonna pave the cul-de-sacs. We're gonna, like there's a whole like system of things that we would work with you to come up with and in a sense customize your neighborhood for you. I think there's a way for cities to do this around housing, around infrastructure, around park maintenance that actually empowers people to have ownership of their place and see it become, I mean, this is the core Strong Downs insight. When you have ownership, have your place become better over time, as opposed to delegate that authority to the city or the region or the state, and then, have this distant taskmaster that allows your stuff to fall apart despite, your contribution to the tax base.
Yeah. Well, I think we're going to have to call it quits at this point here, but thank you, Chuck, for the answers to these questions, and definitely want to highlight the fact
that was the fastest hour I've had in like a long time.
Hey, we make it easy on you, and then that's what happens when it's not like just a boring old Zoom meeting. So this has been great. I also definitely want to encourage come back next Monday at I should know offhand the exact time. We're doing an event with all of our Strong Towns members around the finance decoder, and the idea is it's a workshop on how to use the finance decoder that we've created and go and check your own city finance documents and find the info that you need about your community. Let me make sure I've got this here. So it's the local financial health worksheet workshop, and that is at
That's
3:30 Central Time. And then
That's catchy.
Wednesday, Chuck, actually, why don't you talk about the live stream? Because you're excited about it. Your little travel tour, meeting up with Strong Towns folks virtually all across North America.
I'm excited about it. I am excited about it. So, okay, next week is our member drive. And that means that we go kind of public radio for a week, and all of our channels and streams are encouraging people to sign up. Our team has done an astounding job growing our YouTube audience over the last 2 years. It's really been phenomenal. Our YouTube audience has been the biggest growth that we have. Edward had a video last week that got 1 million views. I'm going to tell you, I've written a lot of articles that have been read by a lot of people. I've never written anything that's gotten 1 million views. So video is this very weird realm where we're seeing a lot of uptake and a lot of people like onboarding into our conversation. So one of the new things we're doing during Member Week this time is we're doing this member live stream. And I think we've had internal jokes where we've called it like the mega stream or something like that. It's actually 4 hours of me sitting here and then bringing in people from around the country. They've got a map. So we're going to start on the East Coast, and we're going to move across the country and bring in different people from different communities that, we've got different things to chat about. You can think of it like a 4-hour podcast, but it's going to be not podcasty. It's going to be, let's talk about your place. Let's talk about your place, and having everything from elected officials to local bottom-up advocates, and even my daughter's going to make a guest appearance when we get to Brainerd.
Awesome. And some giveaways. Yep.
And some giveaways and fun. Yep. And yeah, it's going to be pretty cool. And they got a membership counter that we're going to have to kind of track new member signups. And yeah, we're going to try this out and see how it goes.
My worry is that it'll be like a Gen X millennial version of what the Gen Zers just naturally do. So, but I think it'll be awesome. Modern day telethon. Love it, Joel. Yeah, that'll be great.
There is that fear that, I think one of the things that I've recognized as a 51-year-old guy with teenage daughters is that, some of it's cool, some of it's not. So I'm trying to lean into our younger people here who are, setting up the YouTube part. And they've just told me your part's just to MC the thing. So that's what I'm going to try to do.
Well, that's fantastic. Like you said, I feel like that hour just flew by. Really appreciate each person that's able to drop in today as a Strong Towns member. Your support continues to help build the movement. We'll see you next week as we celebrate your participation in the Strong Towns movement during our member drive, during our member week, we should call it, because it really is a celebration of membership and the growing impact that the Strong Towns movement as a whole is making as we reach more folks. With that, thanks for joining Ask Strong Towns Anything.